The cattle baron never married anyone, until the barefoot servant poured his coffee. The cup was chipped on the left side. I'd known that for 11 years. Every morning I set it on the same corner of the table, chip facing in so I wouldn't catch my lip on it. And every morning I poured my own coffee from the same blue enamel pot and stood at the window and watched the light come up over the east ridge. Didn't need a thing from anyone. Hadn't in a long time. That was the arrangement I'd made with myself sometime around my 43rd year, after the last time I let myself want something I didn't get. The ranch was mine. The land, 4,200 acres of hard grass and creek draw and good high pasture, was mine. The cattle wore my brand. The hands knew my name and kept their distance, which suited me. I wasn't a cruel man. I just wasn't a soft one. There's a difference, and I knew it, even if most folks around Garrison couldn't see it. My name is Callum Hess. I was 58 years old when Nora Vass came to work in my house, and I want to be straight about what I was when she got there. A man who had stopped expecting, not given up exactly. More like decided. The way you decide a particular trail is washed out and you find another way around, and after a while you stop thinking about the first trail at all. She came with her mother, Dora, who'd been hired as the cook. Dora was a heavy woman with bad knees who moved slow but worked clean and didn't talk my ear off, which I appreciated. She'd mentioned a daughter who'd help with the house. I said fine. I didn't ask anything further about it. The first morning Nora was there, I came down before dawn the way I always do. The kitchen was lit. Somebody had already stoked the stove and the coffee was on. I stopped in the doorway. She was standing at the dry sink with her back to me, washing something in a basin. No shoes. Just her bare feet on the cold plank floor, pale as birch wood in the lamplight. Her hair was loose, not yet pinned, hanging halfway down her back. She heard me, didn't startle, just turned and looked at me the way you'd look at a tree in a yard, like I was a thing she'd already accounted for. "Mr. Hess," she said, "coffee's hot." She poured it without being asked, set it on the table, chip facing in. I hadn't told her about the chip. I sat down and drank it, and she went back to whatever she was washing, and we didn't say another word. And when I got up and went out to start the day, I thought, she noticed, just that. A small thing. But I noticed that she noticed, and that was the beginning of it, though I didn't know that yet. I want to be honest about Garrison and what I was in that town, because it matters for what comes after. I was the largest single landowner in the county. I'd built the Hess Ranch from a quarter section my father left me in debt, running 40 head on land that needed 200 to turn a profit, to what it was when Nora came. Branded cattle running close to 1,000 head, 2 good hay meadows, a horse operation that sold to the Army and the railroad both. I'd done that in 30 years, with my hands and my judgment, and more bad winters than I care to count. 30 years is a long time to work toward something. When you're working toward it, you don't notice so much what you're leaving behind. You get up before light, you ride out, you solve the problems that are in front of you, you come back in the dark. You eat alone, or you eat with hired men who call you boss and mean it in a way that keeps the distance between you. You don't marry because marrying means explaining yourself, and explaining yourself takes time, and there's always another fence down or another head sick or another drought coming on. That was what I told myself anyway, that there wasn't time. The truth was something different, but I didn't look at the truth directly for a long time. The truth was that I had married once in a way, not legally. There'd been a woman named Margaret Corin when I was 36, a school teacher in the next county, smart and particular and clear-eyed about things. We'd kept company for over a year. I thought we had an understanding. Turned out we had different understandings. She decided she needed a man who could be present in the way ranching doesn't always allow for. She wasn't wrong. She went and married the hardware man in Caldera, and I heard she was happy with him, and I believed it, and I did not go near that territory again. After Margaret, I made the decision. Settled it in my head the way you settle a land matter, clearly, legally, with no intention of revisiting. The ranch was the thing. The cattle, the pasture, the horses, the hay. That was what I was building, and that was enough. Whatever else a man might want was a luxury I decided I could do without. So by the time I was 58 and Nora came, I had been without that luxury for 22 years. 2 decades of having exactly what I decided to have. You'd think a man would be at peace with it. In some ways I was. In other ways I didn't look at, it had made me into something that sat in a cold kitchen before dawn and poured his own coffee and watched the light come and didn't feel much about any of it. The numbness had set in slow enough that I hadn't noticed it going in. You don't notice cold getting into the ground. It just happens, a little more every day, and then one morning the frost is deep and you wonder when that happened. The town respected me. Let me say what that means precisely, because respected is a word that covers a lot of different things. When Callum Hess rode into Garrison, men nodded and some touched their hat brim. Merchants dealt straight with me because I was a reliable account and had been for 20 years. The few ranchers left in the county talked to me about water rights and grass conditions and what the railroad was doing to beef prices, and I talked back because those were things I knew and cared about. I sat in the back at church. I left before the singing. Nobody called on me on a Sunday afternoon. Nobody invited me to supper. My name was on 2 buildings in town. I'd backed the construction of the livery and I'd put in toward the new school, and that was considered a point of pride for Garrison, having Callum Hess put his money toward things. They pointed to the buildings when they talked about me, not to me. I was the name on the buildings and the name on the cattle and the man who sat in the back of the church and left before the singing, and that was the shape of my life in Garrison. Known and not known, respected and alone. I didn't say this was a tragedy. I'm not asking for pity. I'm saying what it was so you understand what it meant when things changed. Nora was 34, 14 years younger than me. A widow herself, her husband, a freighter named Vass, had died of a fever 3 winters before she came, leaving her with nothing but her mother and some debts that took a year to clear. That's why they'd taken the work. Not because either of them wanted to be in service. Because they needed steady work and a roof, and I needed a cook and someone to keep the house from going entirely to seed, which it had been doing for years. A house with only one person in it for a decade does something particular to itself. It wasn't dirty. I was orderly by nature, by necessity, but it had the feel of a place where nothing extra happened. Just the minimum, just what was required. She had a straight back, narrow hands with the knuckles a little thick from work. A face that was not the kind of face you'd call pretty in a soft way. It was particular, direct. She had dark eyes that took things in without comment, and her mouth sat in a line that wasn't quite serious and wasn't quite anything else. When she looked at something, she really looked at it. When she looked at you, same thing. She moved through my house like she was figuring it out. Careful, deliberate. She never moved anything without a reason, and when she did move something, she put it somewhere better, and after a few weeks I noticed everything was slightly better arranged than it had been, and I couldn't have told you specifically what she'd done. The kindling box was closer to the stove. The lamp on the table sat on a piece of folded oilcloth I hadn't thought to put under it. My mail was stacked by the door instead of scattered across the sideboard. The water pitcher on the washstand was full when I woke in the morning instead of whatever it happened to be the night before. Nothing dramatic, just better. Like someone had looked at how the house worked and thought about how it could work better and made the small adjustments without drawing attention to the fact of having made them. I watched her. I'm not going to pretend I didn't. Not like a fool. I wasn't moony about it. I was 58 years old and I'd been watching people and horses and weather and land for most of my life, and I knew how to observe without making a thing of it. She moved the way a person moves who doesn't have anything to prove. No performance. Not for me, not for the hands when they came to the kitchen door for their noon meal, not for her mother, not for anyone. She did the work because the work needed doing and she was the one there to do it. If someone thanked her, she said you're welcome and moved on. If someone didn't thank her, it didn't seem to matter to her either. She didn't need the acknowledgement to know she'd done the thing right. That was the thing. I'd been around enough women who performed, who laughed louder than they meant to around men they wanted something from, or went quiet and careful in a way that was its own kind of performance. Nora did none of that. She was the same at 4 in the morning, alone in the kitchen, as she was when I walked through the door or when the hands were around. The same steady economy of movement, the same direct look. It unsettled me in a quiet way. I wasn't used to people being that plain. I'll tell you the moment I understood what was happening inside me, even though I didn't say anything for a long time after. It was in October, about 4 months after she came. We'd had a hard norther blow through, the first real one of the season, and it took part of the roof off the old equipment barn, not the main barn, the older one on the west side that I'd been meaning to reshingle for 2 years, and had never got to because there was always something more pressing. I spent the morning up there with 2 hands, Martinez and a younger one called Roof, nailing boards in wind that wanted to knock you off the rafters. Cold had set in overnight and the boards were stiff and the nails wanted to slip. By noon my hands were half frozen. The wind had driven grit into my eyes and down my collar, and I'd caught a nail wrong on my left palm, not deep, but the cold had slowed the bleeding to a slow seep that had been filling the glove for an hour. I came in through the kitchen door, wet and cold, my hand throbbing, tired in the way that goes past tired into something older and emptier. The kind of tired that isn't about the body, more like a tiredness that comes from asking things of yourself for 30 years and wondering sometimes whether the asking was worth it. Nora was at the stove. She looked at me once, just once, the way she did, taking in the whole of me in a second, and she set down what she was holding and came across the kitchen and took my left hand without asking, turned it over, looked at the cut. Her expression didn't change. She went to the shelf where she kept a tin of things, cleaned the cut with something that stung without comment from either of us, and wrapped it with a strip of clean cloth she tore efficiently from what I think was an old shirt. Then she went and poured the coffee and set it in front of me and went back to the stove. She didn't say, "You should be more careful." She didn't say, "Poor thing." She didn't make anything of it. She just did what needed doing and then moved on. I sat there with my wrapped hand around the warm cup and felt something happen in my chest that I couldn't name right away. It took me a while, sitting there in the quiet kitchen with the wind still going outside and the smell of whatever was on the stove, to put a word to it. I am not invisible to her. That's what it was. Not the tending of the hand itself, though that was something. It was how she'd moved without hesitation, without theater, without needing me to ask. She'd seen what I was and what I needed, and she'd simply addressed it, like I was a person who mattered, like what had happened to me was something worth a response. That sounds small. It wasn't. I had been invisible for a long time. Not to the town. They saw Callum Hess, the land and the cattle and the name. But the man inside the name, the one who'd gone cold somewhere in his 30s and never quite found his way back, the one who sat in that kitchen every morning before dawn and felt the emptiness of the place and just kept going anyway because going was what you did, that man nobody saw. Nobody had looked for him. I'd stopped expecting anyone to. The numbness I mentioned earlier had a companion, and the companion was this. The quiet understanding that nobody was particularly looking at you as a man anymore, and maybe that was just what happened when you got to a certain age and a certain kind of life, and you had to be all right with it. I'd been all right with it. But sitting there with the wrapped hand around the coffee cup, I thought, she sees me. She looked at me in the doorway, and she didn't see the ranch and the brand. She saw a man who'd been out in the cold for 3 hours and come in with a hurt hand and needed his coffee. She saw what was actually there. That I hadn't had in a very long time. I held that close for a while. I'm not quick about things. I never have been. I'd learned over 58 years that rushing toward something is the best way to ruin it or yourself or both. So I let it sit. Went out and finished the barn roof. Came in the next morning and drank my coffee and watched the East Ridge come light, same as every day, except that something was different in the watching. There's a section of time here, November into January, that I'll cover the way it actually was, which is slowly. Things between people don't happen fast when both of them are careful and know from experience what moving too fast costs you. I was careful because I was 58, and I'd made a decision 2 decades back, and undeciding felt like standing at the edge of something I couldn't see the bottom of. She was careful because she'd loved someone and lost him and had come up from that with nothing, and she was standing on her own feet, and you don't risk that lightly. So we were slow, and in the slowness things accumulated. We talked more, not dramatically, just the way two people in the same house will, when neither of them is going out of the way to avoid it. She asked me once about the high pasture, what it looked like in summer, after I'd mentioned moving some cows up there in June. I told her the creek that ran cold even in August, the way the grass was a different color up there, greener and thicker, the elk that came through in the evenings and stood in the water. She listened like she actually wanted to know. She'd ask a practical question sometimes about a fence situation, about where the water came from, whether the creek in the South Draw flooded in spring, and the questions were good ones. She understood land. You could tell she'd grown up with it, with what it asked of you and what it gave back. One afternoon in November, I came in from the range early and found her at the kitchen table with some mending and a lamp already lit, the light coming down short. I sat across from her, and I don't know exactly why I asked what I asked. Sometimes your mouth moves before you've decided to let it. What would you do, I said, if you could do anything, not in service, if you could choose? She kept the needle moving for a moment. Then she set the work down and thought about it honestly. That was one of the things about her. She didn't answer fast just to fill the space. She thought first. Have my own kitchen, she said. My own garden, someplace that was mine. What kind of garden? Vegetables first, practical, then whatever wanted to grow. Like what? She almost smiled. Lavender, some things with yellow flowers, I don't know all the names. Things that smell good when you walk past them. I nodded and we went on to something else, but I carried that. She didn't want someone to sweep in and make her life easier. She didn't want to be taken care of in the way some women want, and there's no shame in that want, but it wasn't her. She wanted something of her own, a piece of ground and a kitchen and the right to grow things that smelled good. That kind of want I understood. It was the same impulse that had built the Hess Ranch out of a quarter section in debt. You want something that's yours, something that proves you were here and did a thing. I understood that in my bones, and knowing she was built on the same kind of ground, I was made something in me settle that I hadn't known was unsettled. December was quiet. The shortest days, the longest nights, the cattle heavy with winter coat and too much time standing around the feed. I spent more evenings inside than I usually did. The house had started feeling less empty than it used to. That was new. The house had always felt like what it was, a working structure, functional, mine, and hollow at the center. The kitchen was lit at 4 in the morning now. There was the smell of her cooking in the rooms. There was her voice somewhere in the house, low and even, talking to her mother in the evenings. I could hear it from my office across the hall, and I didn't try to make out the words. Just the sound of it. People being in a place together. A sound I hadn't had in the house in years, and its absence had been so gradual that I hadn't known I was missing it until it was back. I made myself not think too hard about what that meant. I wasn't ready yet. January was hard in the way January gets when everything decides to go wrong at once. Cold set in deep at the start of the month, the kind that gets into the animals and slows everything down, and makes the mornings feel like something to be endured rather than just gotten through. We lost 3 head to a ravine collapse in the west pasture. They'd broken through ice over a creek draw I should have fenced better, and I knew it, and it sat badly with me in the particular way things sit when you know the fault was yours. One of my best hands, Pickett, left for California with his brother, which I understood but didn't like. I took on a new man, young and willing but slow to learn, and for 3 weeks everything took twice as long as it should have. I was short-tempered and tired, and some mornings I sat at that table with my chipped cup and felt the weight of the place press down in a way I didn't usually let it. 4,200 acres, and I'd built it alone, and sometimes alone felt like an achievement, and sometimes it just felt like alone. The distinction lives in the quiet of an early morning when you've got everything you worked for surrounding you and the house is still. You keep that distinction private because there's nobody to say it to, and because saying it doesn't change anything. But it was there. One morning in late January, early, before her mother was up, Nora came into the kitchen and found me sitting there not drinking my coffee. Just sitting. I wasn't doing anything, just sitting in the dark with a cold cup and my hands around it and my eyes on nothing. I don't know what I looked like. Whatever a man looks like when he's been at something for 30 years and is suddenly, unexpectedly, tired of it in a way he wasn't expecting to be. She didn't say anything. She poured her own cup and came and sat down across from me, and the lamplight was between us on the table. She didn't ask what was wrong, didn't offer anything, just sat there in the early dark, two people at a table with their coffee. After a while she said, "You're carrying something heavy." Not a question, not prying, just noticing the way she'd noticed the cut on my hand, taking in what was true. "The ranch," I said, "winter." "The usual." "Oh." A sound that meant she'd heard me, that was all. But she stayed there, didn't get up and go back to her tasks, didn't fill the silence with words or questions or any of the things people do when they don't know what to do with quiet. Just sat with me in it, in the wait and the dark and the tired. Sat there like my company in that state was something she was willing to keep, like there was nowhere she needed to be more than right here across from a man who was having a hard morning. Being sat with, it sounds like nothing, it isn't nothing, I know that now. I said after a while, "Do you ever get tired?" She looked at me across the lamp. "Of what?" "All of it, starting over, working in someone else's house when you had your own." She thought about it. Her fingers were around the cup. Outside the window the dark was still total. "Yes," she said, "but tired isn't the same as stopped." I looked at her and she looked back at me, steady across the table, and I thought, I have to say something eventually. Not now, but eventually. Because something is happening here and I can either be the man who acknowledges it or the man who doesn't, and I have been the man who doesn't for 22 years, and I know what that cost me. I took my time, that's who I am, I don't apologize for it. February came in mean. Ice on the water troughs every morning that had to be broken before the cattle could drink. Wind off the flats that cut through your coat and found the back of your neck and stayed there all day. Martinez pulled a muscle in his back and was half useful for 2 weeks, which meant his share of the work fell to Ruth and young Cordell, who was still learning what a full day's work on a cattle operation actually required. Everything needed more than it usually did. But she was there. Every morning the kitchen lit at 4. Some mornings she'd have biscuits in the pan already, and the smell of them would hit me before I was fully awake, and some animal part of me would respond to it: warmth, food, someone in the house who knew I was coming. I hadn't had that in a long time. The smell of someone cooking for you is a specific thing. It means something about your place in the world, whether you've decided you want it to or not. Small things accumulated. She knew how I took my coffee without being told: strong, black, no sugar, hot enough to matter. She knew I didn't want to talk before I'd been outside once. She knew when I came in from a bad day by something I must carry in how I moved, and on those days she was just present without expectation, without questions, without the particular kind of attention that has a cost to it. She never said anything about it. She just adjusted. The way a good person adjusts to another person when they're paying attention to who that person actually is. I started noticing myself looking for her when I came in from the range. Not in a searching way, more like the eye naturally going to where she usually was. The kitchen, the garden plot she'd started clearing even in the cold, the chair by the lamp in the evening. taking in that she was there, that the house had a person in it besides me. I hadn't lived like that since I was a boy in my father's house, before he died and the land came to me, and I became the man who kept it. There was a thing that happened in late February that I've thought about since. One of the mares had a rough foaling, her third time, but the foal was coming wrong and she was in trouble. I was in the barn most of the night, Martinez with me, and we lost the foal around 3 in the morning and nearly lost the mare. I got her through it, but it was close and messy, and by the time I came in at 4:30, I was worn down to something close to nothing. The kitchen light was on. She was there. She hadn't been up, her hair was loose and she had a shawl around her shoulders, but she'd heard me come in. She didn't ask what happened. She could see it. She put a plate in front of me, something she'd heated from supper, and she sat across the table and I ate without tasting it, and when I was done she took the plate away and came back and put her hand on my arm for just a moment, just a second, just that, and then she went back to bed. I sat there for a while after. The kitchen was quiet. Outside the window the dark was starting to thin at the far edge. I thought, I have been alone in this barn with animals in trouble for 30 years, and I have come inside after, and the house has been empty, and I have been fine with it because fine with it was what I'd decided to be. But I was sitting there with my arm still warm where her hand had been, and I thought, this is what I have been missing. Not comfort exactly, not someone to fix it, just someone who knew. Someone who put a plate down and sat across from me and put their hand on my arm for 1 second and went to bed. Someone who knew I was there and that it had been a hard night and that I didn't need to explain any of it. I sat with that for a good long while. The light came up slow over the east ridge. The horses moved in the barn. Somewhere down the creek, a coyote said something and then went quiet. I thought, I am going to have to say something, and soon, before I lose my nerve or talk myself back into the old decision, because the old decision was wrong and I'm old enough to know it, and if I don't say something now, I'll be the kind of fool who knew the right thing and didn't do it. March came and the ground started to soften and the light lasted longer. I've been thinking for weeks about what I needed to say. I was almost ready. Almost. I needed to be sure of something first, not sure she'd say yes. I wasn't assuming anything about what her answer would be, but sure of myself, sure that what I was moving toward was real and not just loneliness or winter or the fact of her being there and being good. Because those things are real too, and they can fool you. They can make you want something for the wrong reasons, and I'd spent 22 years being careful about the wrong reasons, and I wasn't going to get to the end of all that carefulness and ruin it by not being clear in myself about what I was doing. The thing I had to be sure of was this: I wanted her specifically, not a wife, not company, not someone to fill the house up and make the morning smell like biscuits, though all of those things were real. I wanted her. Nora Vass, who noticed the chip in the cup without being told, who sat with me in the dark at 4 in the morning without asking what was wrong, who wanted a kitchen garden with lavender and yellow flowers and something of her own, who answered honestly when you asked her something and thought before she answered, who looked at me like I was a real person and not a piece of land with a name on it. I turned that over for a while, let it stand up to examination. It stood. First thaw, middle of March. The mud was back and the pastures smelled like wet earth and old snow and the beginnings of something green underneath it. The light was staying longer every day and the cattle were already restless to get to grass, moving toward the fence lines and looking past them. I'd been up since before 3 doing a circuit of the east fence line, which had heaved with the frost in a half-dozen spots and needed attention before we started moving cattle. Came back around mid-morning, mud on my boots up past the ankle. She was in the kitchen garden, just the dirt plot off the south side, nothing planted yet, too early, but she'd been clearing it through February, getting the winter-killed things up, turning the edges. She was turning soil with a narrow spade, her back to the house. Barefoot. Of course barefoot. The mud was cold, but I'd seen her work barefoot in weather that should have kept shoes on a person. Her shoes were sitting on the step, set together neatly. The morning sun was on the south wall, and it came off the whitewash in a way that made the whole side of the house bright, and she was in the middle of that brightness, turning dark mud with the spade. I stood at the corner of the house and watched her work for a while, maybe a minute. She knew I was there. She had the kind of awareness about her surroundings that some people are born with and most aren't, but she didn't stop. Kept the spade going, turned a clump over, broke it apart, moved down the row. "Cold," I said. "Ground's warmer than the air." She didn't look up. "You can feel it if you take your shoes off." "I'll take your word for it." She paused then and leaned on the spade and looked at me. The sun was on her face, and there was mud on her feet, and her hair had come partly down from its pin in the wind, and she was looking at me with those steady dark eyes, waiting. I walked over. The mud pulled at my boots. I stopped a few feet from her. "I've been thinking about something," I said. "I know," she said. "You know." For a while now, not teasing, not performing, just stating what was true. I looked at her, and she was quiet for a moment. She looked at me the way she looked at things, directly, taking me in, not flinching from what was there. "I think you're a good man, Callum Hess," she said. "I think you've been alone a long time, and I think it was your choice. I think you made it for reasons that made sense to you and probably were right at the time. And I think those reasons might not be as solid as they used to be." I didn't say anything. "I think you see me," she said. "Not just a woman who keeps your house, me, who I am. And I think you know the difference because you're not a man who does things without knowing what he's doing." A pause. "And I see you, not the land and not the name, not Callum Hess the cattle baron. You, the man who sits in the dark before dawn and drinks cold coffee and carries things he doesn't say out loud. I see him. I've seen him since the first morning." The spade was standing in the dirt between us. Wind moved through her loose hair. She waited. "I'm 58 years old," I said. Set in my ways I don't always notice until someone points them out. "I'm 34 and I've been widowed, and I know what loss feels like, and I'm not looking for easy. I've never been good at being present the way some men can be. There's always the ranch, something that needs." "I know," she said. "I grew up with land. I understand what it asks, and I'm not asking you to be a different man than you are." I looked at her, standing in the cold mud, bare feet, the wind coming, looking back at me without any backing away in her face. "I'm asking you to marry me," I said. "Not asking you to think it over, asking." She looked at me for a long moment, long enough that I thought about all the things she might say and what I'd do with each of them. Then she stepped forward, mud between her bare toes, and she took hold of my coat with one hand, just the lapel, a solid grip, like she was anchoring herself or me or both of us, and she said, "Yes." Plain and quiet, and she meant every bit of it. I could feel the certainty of it through the grip on my coat. I put my hand over hers and held it there against my chest, her cold fingers under my palm, and we stood in the mud in the March wind, and I could feel my heart beating. I hadn't truly felt it in years. Not like that. Not like something was actually happening. She didn't cry, and I didn't say anything else for a long time, and neither of us needed to. We married in April, a Thursday, because that's when the circuit preacher came through Garrison. No big ceremony, Dora and Martinez and Ruth and Cordell and the preacher, and the two of us in the front room of the house. Nora wore a gray dress and her good shoes. She looked not different than she always looked. That's what I remember most clearly. She was just herself, standing next to me in the front room of the house we'd both lived in for different amounts of time, saying the words like she meant them, which she did. The preacher said what preachers say, and we said what you say back, and then it was done, and Dora cried a little, and Martinez shook my hand with real feeling, and Ruth looked like he approved without knowing quite what to do with that fact, and that was the shape of it. No fuss, no performance, which was right for both of us. That night, the first night, after everyone had gone and the house was quiet, she sat across from me at the table like she always had, and we had supper and didn't talk much, and outside the window the last light was going off the ridge, and I thought, This is what it is now. This. The house with a person in it who sees me. The kitchen that has her in it. The morning with coffee already poured. I wasn't sure what I'd done to deserve it. I'm still not sure, but it was there. The first few weeks of being married were strange in a good way. Strange because I'd spent so long being alone in a house that I'd stopped thinking of it as a house that could have more than one person in it. A house is a container for one person's particular silences, and then another person comes and the silences shift, and some of them go away and new ones arrive, and you're not sure at first if you want the new ones. I found myself, those first weeks, being more careful about where I put things down, more aware of the sound of my own boots on the floor late at night, aware that I was sharing the air with someone. It's a strange thing to be aware of after decades without it. She moved through those weeks without making anything of the strangeness. She didn't fill the silences up. She let them be what they were and occupied her own and let me occupy mine, and after a while the two silences stopped feeling separate. Her mother stayed on through the summer, then went to her sister in Colorado in September, which was where she'd always meant to go eventually. Nora saw her off at the stage and came back quiet. I didn't say anything about it. That evening I came and sat with her the way she'd once sat with me in the dark at 4 in the morning, and she leaned against me, just her shoulder against mine, and we sat there until the lamp burned low. That was the way of it. I want to say it went smooth after that. It didn't entirely. I was still difficult, still stubborn in the ways you get stubborn when you've run things alone for 30 years and your instinct is always to handle it yourself, whatever it is. There were weeks where the ranch ate everything I had, and I came in at the end of a day with nothing left, and she could feel it, and I wasn't always able to bridge the distance. I'd go quiet in ways that had nothing to do with her, and she'd see it, and sometimes it would be a day before I could say so, before I could come back to being present rather than just being in the same room. She was patient in a way that wasn't soft, patience that had spine in it. She didn't make things smaller than they were or bigger. She didn't crowd me when I needed space, and she didn't disappear when I was ready to come back. She stayed in her own self, steady, and when I came back I was always glad she was there, and she always let me come back without any price on it. I'll tell you about one time it got hard enough that I wasn't sure it would mend. It was our first spring, April, and I'd made a decision about the horse operation. A contract with a buyer out of Cheyenne that I'd taken without talking to her about it, which I should have, because it affected the whole year's planning and she was keeping the books. When she found out, she didn't yell. She sat across from me at the table and told me plainly that she couldn't keep things in order if I made decisions like that without telling her, and she was right. And I knew she was right, and I told her so in the tone of a man who doesn't like being told he's wrong even when he is, which is a tone I'm not proud of. She looked at me for a long moment and then she said, "All right. I've said what I had to say," and she went back to the books. We were cool with each other for 3 days. Not cruel, I said what needed saying at meals and so did she, and we were civil. But the warmth was gone and the kitchen felt the way it had before she came, and I sat at that table with my chipped cup and felt the absence of it like something physical, like a window left open in January. On the 4th morning she came down and poured her coffee and sat across from me and said, "Are you going to tell me things before you decide them, or are you going to keep deciding and then informing me?" I looked at her. "Tell you before," I said. "Good," she said, and that was that. She wasn't soft about it and she wasn't hard about it. She just needed to know it was settled, and when it was settled, she was done with it. I thought about that for a long time afterward, the way she'd let the 3 days be what they were without trying to rush past them or drag them out. The way she'd asked her question without accusation in it, just plainly, and taken my answer plainly. The way she didn't make me pay for having been wrong after I'd said I was wrong. That's a harder thing than it sounds. Most people don't know how to do that. I knew then, if I hadn't been sure before, that I'd married someone I could actually be with for the long years. Not someone who wanted the same things in the same amounts. Someone who knew how to navigate the space between two different people without destroying it. She got her garden. That first spring after we married, she put in vegetables on the south side, beans, squash, onions, a proper kitchen garden, things with purpose. Then along the edges she put in the other things. Lavender on the south edge, which came in thick by midsummer, and you could smell it from the porch in the afternoon heat. Some plants with small yellow flowers she'd gotten from a woman in town. Things that had no purpose except to be there and be good. She'd go out early some mornings before the heat came, barefoot in the dirt, checking on things, pinching things back, doing the small quiet work that gardens require. I'd see her from the window sometimes, walking the rows, bending down to look at something close. She was good at the quiet work of it, same as she was good at everything she put her hands to, patient and direct. She read more than I did. She had opinions I hadn't expected about land policy, about the railroad and what it was doing to small ranchers up and down the territory, about the territory's future. She'd say what she thought, not to argue, just because she was thinking out loud and I happened to be there. I started saying what I thought back, which is something I hadn't done with another person in 20 years or more. Having someone to think out loud at, to push back on and be pushed back on. It sounds like a small thing. It changed something in me. She laughed at me sometimes, not cruelly. I was stubborn in particular ways, particular to the shape of the man I'd become in 58 years alone, and sometimes I'd say something or do something so characteristic that she'd get a look on her face and then she'd laugh. And after a while I could see, in what she was laughing at, the thing she was really seeing. And it was funny. The particular stubbornness of a man who spent too long being right on his own. I started to see it myself, and sometimes I'd catch it before she did and say something dry, and she'd know I was laughing at myself, and that would make her laugh more, and that sound in the house was something I never got tired of hearing. The hands saw the change. I know they did. Martinez told me once, not directly, because that's not how men say these things, he said the place felt different. Good different. I said yeah, and we left it there. The first winter we were married, November into February, was a mild one by that country's standards, not easy, but not the kind that breaks things. We got through it the way you get through winters on a cattle operation, together in the necessary work and together at the end of the day when the work was done. There was a particular quality to those evenings. The stove going, the lamp lit, her with her book or her mending, me with whatever needed doing, the silence between us being a different kind of silence than the silence of the years before. Inhabited. Two people's silence has a different weight than one person's. Some nights she'd read something out loud, not asking, just doing it if something struck her, and I'd listen and sometimes I'd have something to say and sometimes not, and either way was fine. Some nights I'd be at the table with the ranch accounts, and she'd come and look over my shoulder at something without asking if she could, just interested, and I'd find myself explaining what I was working through, which meant I was thinking out loud to another person, which was something I hadn't done in this house before. Thinking out loud to another person turns out to be one of the underrated pleasures of a life. You hear yourself differently when someone else can hear you too. By the time the spring came, I couldn't have told you precisely when the arrangement of our days had stopped feeling new and started feeling like just our days. That's how it works when it's right. It stops being a thing you notice because it stops being separate from the rest of living. There were hard things. The drought in the second year nearly broke us, dried up 2 of the creek draws, cut our grazing by 1/3, meant selling cattle I didn't want to sell and borrowing against next year's hay. I didn't sleep well for 3 months, and I know she didn't either, though she didn't say so. She just pulled in tighter and spent less and worked harder and made do without asking me what we could or couldn't afford, because she could see it in the numbers same as I could, and she understood that asking would only make it heavier for me. When we came out the other side of it, when the rains came back and the grass came back and we built the herd back up, she didn't make anything of what we'd come through, just kept going. There was also the matter of my hands, by the 3rd year. The cold gets into them now in a way it didn't when I was younger, the joints mostly. The right hand where I broke 2 fingers in '61 and they healed crooked. Some mornings I'd come into the kitchen and she'd see me trying to work the coffee pot, and she'd take it from me without comment and pour it and set it down, and that was that. Not making me feel less than. Not soft about it either. Just practical, the way she was practical about everything. I'd thanked her the first time and she'd looked at me with those dark eyes and said, "Don't thank me. It's just coffee." And I understood what she meant, which was, you're not less because your hands hurt in the cold. You're just a man with cold hands, and I'm right here. I'm 62 now, 4 years married. The hands are different men than when she came. Roof left for his own land up north. I hired a Comanche man named Aldous who'd worked cattle across 2 territories and knew more about bovine condition than most men I'd ever met, and Cordell had turned into something worth having. The land is the same, 4,200 acres of hard grass and creek draw and good high pasture. The cattle still wear my brand. But the house is different. The house is a house now, not just a structure. There's a kitchen garden on the south side with lavender along the edge and yellow flowers whose name I still don't know. There's a lamp in the window at night. There's the sound of her in the house, her voice and her step, and the particular sound she makes when she's reading something that interests her, a small exhale, and the sound of water in the kitchen at 4 in the morning. And in the evenings she sits at the table with her book and I sit across with nothing much, just being there, and the lamplight is on the table between us and the stove is still warm from supper, and I look at her sometimes, not every night but sometimes, and she knows it and looks back at me, and there's nothing that needs saying. I think sometimes about what I decided all those years ago, that the first trail was washed out, that certain things were past me and I'd made my peace with that. I was wrong. Not about the peace. I had made a kind of peace with it, and the peace was real. I was wrong about the thing itself being past. It wasn't past. It was there, still there, on the other side of a 22-year decision, and the only reason I found it was that she was there to find, and she was the kind of woman who noticed a chip in a cup and turned my coffee so it faced away from my lip. She didn't rescue me. I want to be clear about that. She didn't come in and fix Callum Hess. What she did was see me. See the actual man and decide he was worth seeing and stay. And in being seen and having someone stay with the whole of me, the difficult parts and the empty parts and the parts that were good, something that had gone cold started to come back slowly, the way ground warms in spring. Not dramatically, not all at once, just over days and weeks and months warmer. That's the whole of it, or that's the part worth telling. What's left is just the life. The mornings and the evenings and the hard winters and the good springs and the work that never stops and her in the garden and her across from me at the table and her voice somewhere in the house and all of it being real and mine. Being mine and hers at the same time, which is something I didn't know how to hold before her. I think about the cup sometimes, the chipped one. She never changed it. She'd have had every right to. She's the one who keeps the kitchen. She could have put it in the back of the shelf and gotten out a whole one. She didn't. It's still on the same corner of the table every morning, chip facing in, coffee hot and poured without being asked. She knew without being told. That's the thing. She's always known without being told what's worth leaving alone and what needs tending, which things are just mine and which things need her hands on them. The cup is mine. She left it alone. Me, she didn't leave me alone, and I'm glad of it. That's not a small thing. That's the whole thing, maybe, in one small chipped cup left where it belongs. I'm 62, and I've got 4,200 acres, and a good woman who sees me, and a kitchen that smells like coffee before dawn and lavender in the south garden and yellow flowers I still don't know the name of, and I think that's plenty. I think that's everything.